A black preacher was arrested for essentially contempt of cop for refusing to identify himself even though he wasn't lawfully required to, as he was doing nothing more than watering his neighbor's yard. Hello everyone and welcome to Uncivil Law, where we learn through the misfortunes of others. As always, I hope you enjoy this legal education content, and today is the day I earned that subscription. For today's story, we are talking about a black preacher who was arrested in Alabama as he was watering his neighbor's yard, and the police had a 20-minute conversation with him where the preacher refused to identify himself because he's not required to, because he's not doing anything wrong. So he has sued the police for this violation of his civil rights. So we're going to learn a little bit more about what is going on in this Alabama town. A pastor who was arrested by white police officers while watering the flowers of a neighbor who was out of town, being a good neighbor, filed a federal lawsuit alleging the ordeal violated his constitutional rights. Michael Jennings has filed a federal lawsuit against 3 officers and the Alabama town of Childsburg requesting jury trial. The suit alleges that the actions of Officer Christopher Smith, Justin Gable, and Sergeant Jeremy Brooks and the city have violated the rights against unlawful arrests and guarantees of freedom of speech. Jennings identified himself during the police interaction as Pastor Jennings, but refused to provide any identification to the officers who arrested him on a charge of obstructing government operations after a 20-minute confrontation that included a raised voice on both sides. Okay, so let's discuss the law very briefly as it relates to identifying yourself to a police officer. So under what circumstances are you required to present ID? Well, the only requirements that would be for presenting ID are for a situation in which the ID itself would be required. The most obvious example, of course, would be driving a car. When you're driving a car, you need to have a driver's license. So you have to present the driver's license upon lawful demand of the police officer because you're engaged in an activity that requires that ID. The driver's license is required in order to drive. But if you're a passenger in the car, of course, you don't need a driver's license. And so if the police asked you for a driver's license, although you might be required to identify yourself, you are not, as the passenger, required to present ID. And similarly, as you're just walking about the streets, although various jurisdictions have different laws when it comes to identifying yourself to a police officer. To the best of my knowledge, no state requires you to present ID to a police officer, except in circumstances such as driving, where the ID itself is required in order to conduct the activity. The reason, of course, you don't have to present ID is because there's no requirement to carry ID. You can't be forced to present something you don't have. And there's no requirement as you're walking out and about that you have a driver's license or any sort of other form of ID. You can just walk around. So you can't be forced to provide it. Again, different states might require you to identify yourself. That would be in the form of verbal, by giving your name, address, or other sort of information as required by law, but that is distinct from presenting the ID itself. In any case, by refusing to present ID, he was not breaking any law. This is just basically contempt of cop, which is not illegal. You can have contempt for the police, and you are not required to present your ID to the police just because they want it. And they are not allowed to arrest you just because they want it. There's something more. So that is the law as it relates to this. And so it seems, on first blush, that Pastor Jennings here is completely in the right. Bernard Simelton, the president of the Alabama branch of the NAACP, who is assisting in this lawsuit, said officers who arrested Jennings did so many things that weren't in line with good community policing tactics. Yeah, a little bit there. These poor judgment decisions reflect poorly on the type of training that Childsburg's police officers receive if they're acting in accordance with those guidelines, which is debatable at best. All right, so that's some information relating to the arrest, but we'd like to have a little bit more. So let's look at a second article. Here's another article that goes into more detail regarding the pastor's arrest for the vile act of watering his neighbor's flowers when his neighbor was out of town. What a jerk. And then refusing to identify himself to the police. And the police officer looking all over here smug in the camera thinking he's all self-righteous. Not so much. Michael Jennings wasn't breaking any laws. Nope, he was there with permission or doing anything that was obviously suspicious. Yeah, this is the problem, right? Even under a Terry stop, you have to have reasonably articulable suspicion. right? So we don't have probable cause to arrest. So I don't know how we're arresting at all. And even in order to do a Terry stop, which will allow you to frisk him, but not arrest, you have to have reasonably articulable suspicion. Otherwise, it's just a purely voluntary interaction. And he doesn't want to interact with you. And you can't arrest him for that. You have a right to remain silent. That is not contempt. A 20-minute video of the episode recorded on one of the officer's body cameras shows how quickly an uneventful evening on a quiet residential street devolved into yet another potentially explosive situation involving a black man and white law enforcement. Now, as for me, and I don't know enough to know for sure, but my first suspicion is not race. My first suspicion is police on a power trip, which can happen to anybody. It can happen to anyone where someone isn't giving the officer exactly what they want, exactly at the right time, and the officer thinks they have a right to arrest for obstruction just because the guy is not being completely compliant, which is not how the law works in any respect. So my first thought is police officer on power trip, but I suppose the facts will bear out what the motivation here. According to the tape, here apparently is part of the interaction. "What you doing here, man?" Officer Christopher Smith asked as he walked up to Jennings, who held a hose with a stream of water falling onto the plants. What you're doing here, I think, would be fairly obvious at this point, since, you have the hose in your hand watering the plants. What you doing here? I mean, kind of obvious, I would think. Watering flowers, Jennings said. Yeah. Lawn decorations stood around the mailbox, fresh mulch covering the beds. It was more than an hour before sunset in May that this event occurred. But moments before, a woman had dialed 911 about a younger black male, and incidentally, he's in his 50s, so I suppose compliment for looking good. About a younger black male and gold SUV she saw at the house, even though the owners were away. And the guy's doing nothing more than watering the flowers. He says, "I'm supposed to be here. I'm Pastor Jennings. I live across the street." Hey, man, that's about as much ID as you're required to give. In any event, even in states that require ID, which I'm not sure this is the situation, right? He's identified himself. "My name's Pastor Jennings. I live across the street," man. He's given his name and address, man. That's about as much as you're required to give anyway. "You're Pastor Jennings?" "Yes, I'm looking out for the house while they're gone, watering the flowers," Jennings said. "Okay, that's cool. Do you have, ID?" He may or may not. He is not required to present ID. He can't be required to present ID because he's not required to have ID on him. The officer can't insist that he present ID that he's not required to have. If he's driving a car, great. You can require the ID, and namely the driver's license, because he's required to have the driver's license to drive. It's right in the name, driver's license. But he's just watering flowers. You don't need a license for that. "So do you have an ID?" "Oh no, man, I'm not going to give you ID," Jennings said. Pog. "Why not?" Smith said. "I ain't done nothing wrong," the pastor said. Pog. "The First Amendment auditors know he's standing on his rights, man. God bless him. You're not required to give the ID to police if you don't want to. And he's insisting he's standing on his rights." Jennings, who's 56, and apparently looked young to the 911 caller, so doing something right in his life, was born in rural Alabama. His parents grew up at a time when racial segregation was the law. "I know the backdrop," Jennings said in an interview with the AP. It might be race, or it could just be the police on a power trip. I'm going with police on a power trip until proven otherwise. But either way, it's still illegal what the police did. The police do not have reasonably articulable suspicion. The police in this situation can do a voluntary interview. Basically, the police's power in this situation is the same as you or me. The police can go up to him just as you or I could, and they can go up to him and ask him questions just as you or I could. And Jennings can refuse to answer those questions or answer them either way. And the police can ask for anything. They can ask for ID because I could ask for ID. And Jennings could say no to me or the police. Even you don't have reasonably articulable suspicion, because what crime are you reasonably articulating? The watering the flowers, man, it's not going great. So, this lawsuit should be successful because the police are way out of their depth here. As Jennings and Smith argued over whether the pastor needs to show ID, he does not. He can't be required to show ID because he's not required to carry ID because he's not doing any activity for which ID he would have to have. Another officer walked into view. The voice rising, Jennings asked who called the police. You see a young black man out here watering his neighbor's flowers and you think something's illegal, Jennings said loudly. I ain't seen nothing about, Smith said. You have no right to approach me if I ain't done something suspicious or nothing wrong. Okay, Jennings is slightly wrong here. The police do have the right to approach him because I have the right to approach him. The police have the same power you or I do at the bare minimum. So can they go up to him and ask him questions? Sure. But Jennings can completely ignore them if he wants to. He can cooperate or not, just like me or not. So they can approach and ask. It's just that they don't have a right to demand anything. So Jennings, getting the law slightly wrong, says you have no right to approach me. That's not quite correct. While the officers are talking, he says, you want to lock me up? Lock me up. I'm not showing you all anything. I'm going to continue watering these flowers. About 35 seconds later, after warning Jennings that charging with obstruction for walking away, that's not obstruction. That's not obstruction. It is not obstruction. Obstruction is when you prevent the officers from doing things. He's not preventing the officers from doing anything. He's walking away. That's kind of the exact opposite of obstruction. He's not hindering them. He's not delaying them. He's not feeding them false information. He's just not cooperating. That is not obstruction. The police apparently have failed to learn that lesson, as so many police officers have. So 35 seconds after the warning, he could be charged with obstruction. No, not so much. The officer put the preacher in handcuffs. I like this, Jennings told him. It's already a lawsuit. It sure is, Jennings. You're well in the right. Alabama law allows the police to ask for the name of someone in a public place when there's reasonable suspicion the person has committed a crime. Now, ask for is not quite right here. The article is slightly wrong. Demand is better, right? The police have the right to demand the name of someone in a public place in Alabama when there's reasonable suspicion the person's committing a crime. That's a Terry stop. But even under Terry, you're not required to present ID because... why? You're not required to carry ID. So the police can ask for your name anytime. The police can demand your name in a Terry stop, but even then, not so much with the refusal there. But that does not mean a man instantly watering flowers must provide identification or even identify himself, right? The police can request it, but he doesn't even have to say, I'm Pastor Jennings, I live across the street. Because the police are just completely in the wrong. This is not a valid Terry stop. Given police the same name he routinely uses as a member of his church, Jennings identified himself without any prompting. Cuffed and seated between two shrubs on a front stoop of his neighbor's house, Jennings told Smith and Gable that his son, a university athletics administrator, had wrongfully detained recently in Michigan after a young woman in a cheerleading competition said a black man had mugged her. My son just got arrested and profiled, he said. The incident, which didn't result in charges, happened 2 months before, so he's a little bit more familiar with this. A third officer, identified as Sergeant Brooks in a report, arrived while Smith was complaining loudly that Jennings wouldn't listen and Gable was all about screaming at the pastor. You have to identify yourself to me, Gable yelled. No, I don't, Jennings replied. Jennings is correct. He does not have to identify himself. The police, and by the way, he has identified himself, because he's given his name and address. My name is Pastor Jennings. I live across the street. He has identified himself. So you're there. Whatever it was enough for Smith. You know what? 1015, he shouted, using for the code for a prisoner in custody. I ain't going to sit there and have that, dude. You are well in the wrong, sir. You have committed an unlawful arrest. You don't have probable cause. You don't have probable cause of any crime. You're going down in this lawsuit. Apart from recent experience with his son, Jennings said he felt anger. Jennings was already in the back of the patrol car by the time Robinson, the white woman who called the police, emerged. Okay, does he have permission to be watching flowers? Smith said. How would she know? He may, because they're friends, she replied. They were out of town today. He may be watering their flowers. It would be completely normal. Oops. Millen told AP that was exactly what happened. He asked Jennings to water his wife's flowers while they were away. Watering flowers wasn't the problem, he said. The issue was Jennings' refusal to provide identification. He's not required to provide identification, and if he was, he provided all the identification you were legally required. He gave his name, he gave his address. I'm Pastor Jennings. I live across the street. Realizing she called the police because one neighbor was watering another, this is probably my fault. No, you're not in the wrong. The police are in the wrong because they're violating the law. A few moments later, officers told Robinson that license plate check showed the Gold Sports utility vehicle that prompted the call in the first case belonged to Millam, so it was the house owner's car. So not so much suspicious as the one that belongs on that property. That got Jennings out of the patrol car and told him first and last name. I didn't know it was him, Robinson told the police. I'm sorry about that. The officers spent much of their remaining time on scene in a discussion that began with the question from Smith, what are we going to do? Release him from custody and pray. That's all you can do at this point. After weighing different options, they settled on a charge of obstructing government operations that was thrown out within days. It is not obstruction. This is not obstruction. Obstruction is not refusal to help. Obstruction is when you actively interfere. Obstruction is when you give false information to police. Obstruction is when you delay them by restraining them or inhibiting them. That's obstruction. It is not obstruction for you to stand on your rights. That's just some BS. The Childsburg interim police chief didn't return email seeking comment. I bet not, because they're all going down hard. But the three officers standing along the street Jennings said was handcuffed talked amongst themselves about what happened. This is all on tape, so this is hilarious. I said, if you just listen to me, you're being audio and video recorded. So are you. So are you being audio and video recorded. And what we're trying to do is identify yourself and find out what's going on. Well, yeah, but you can't. And also he identified himself, so no. Thus, that brings us to the end of the story about the pastor who was watering the flowers, who stood on his rights and refused to cooperate with the police who were way out of line. Pictured here is a pastor, and also pictured here is a police officer who's going down hard for violating the law. Yeah, this is an obstruction. It isn't even close. If you had a reason to do a Terry stop, you might be able to demand him identify himself, but you can't demand he present identification because he's not required to have it. You're not required to have ID as you just walk around in the world, especially as you're watering flowers. So I don't know whether he had ID or not, and I don't care either way. So yeah, this is in violation of law, and then they arrest him on a charge that doesn't make sense because they don't have probable cause. They arrested him on obstruction, and this is an obstruction. So that's an unlawful arrest. That's an unlawful Terry stop. That's violation of his rights. It might be civil rights motivated on top of the rest of it. So yeah, pastor here is going to get paid. And God bless America, because the police can't act this way, because you have absolutely every right in this world to go about your business. And the police can't force you to cooperate with them just because they feel like it. So hopefully that was some good legal education. At least for a moment, that brings us to the end of discussion of this story.